Welcome to this panel session on young women in politics. Those of you who don't know of me, I'm Julie Novak. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you three fantastic young women who are actively involved in public policy debates and in activism itself to spread the good word of liberty throughout the land. So we have as our speakers Trisha, who will be first. Then we have Rachel O'Connor and Lara Jeffery. So without further ado, and when Ms. Jar is ready, she may commence. Thank you.
My name's Trisha Jar. I'm a policy analyst at the Centre for Independent Studies. And today I'm going to talk to you about bleeding heart libertarianism. So, I'm the product of two lifelong Labor voters and the public school system. So it's no surprise that when I started developing the first smatterings of a political conscience, it was tilted firmly in a socially progressive direction. This was born of a youthful and naive assumption that the power of the state was the only real way to secure social freedoms and social justice. To my mind, the government was the only institution. Was the only institution that could stamp out homophobia, sexism, and racism. It was the only thing, paradoxically, that could secure civil liberties. Growing up under Howard meant that to be right-wing was to cater to the establishment, to big business, to the church, and to racists. To cut taxes and to deregulate the economy was to punish the most vulnerable in our society. Being right-wing meant invading Afghanistan and Iraq. So social equality, civil liberties, the most vulnerable in our society, the right of people in foreign countries not to be invaded because our government didn't like their government. These are the things that I cared about 10 years ago, and these are the things I care about today. What changed was my understanding of government and my understanding of the free market. In short, the reputation of government took a nosedive, while the free market suddenly became a more effective guardian of the things that I valued. Freedom became more important than equality, as I realised that equality meant very little if there first wasn't freedom to underpin it. And I think the Friedman quote that Ben used earlier is quite illustrative of this. So with the exception of the most dedicated of Rothbardians and natural rights activists, I think this shift mirrors some of the experiences of the people in this room. Having said all of this, I'm going to talk to you about bleeding heart libertarianism. Bleeding heart libertarianism is a term coined by American libertarian philosopher Max Walensky. It's probably best recognised in the context of the blog Bleeding Heart Libertarians. Here is what the bloggers at Bleeding Heart Libertarians have to say about what they believe. We are libertarians who believe that addressing the needs of the economically vulnerable by remedying injustice, engaging in benevolence, fostering mutual aid, and encouraging the flourishing of free markets is both practically and morally important. The libertarian tradition is home to multiple figures and texts, modelling commitment both to individual liberty and to consistent concern for the marginalised, both here and abroad. We seek here to revive, energise and extend that tradition, to demonstrate that contemporary libertarians can, in addition to their traditional vindication of individual liberty, offer effective, powerful and innovative responses to the problems of economic vulnerability and injustice, and to their social, political and cultural consequences. What comes through in this description is the notion that bleeding heart libertarianism is not a different doctrine to regular libertarianism. It's just a matter of a different emphasis. There are a few reasons why I believe the Australian libertarian community in particular could and should better embrace the principles of bleeding heart libertarianism. One is that I think that bleeding heart libertarianism is the natural heir of 19th century classical liberalism, and classical liberalism is a more natural fit for Australia. Unhyphenated libertarianism is a kooky American thing for most Australians. The US libertarian movement is also infused with a fair amount of cultural specificity, which jars awkwardly when copied and pasted unchanged into the Australian context. The American libertarian fixation on the Second Amendment, which is pretty irrelevant in this country, to be honest about the state of affairs in this country with regards to the right to self-defense, is one example of why an authentic Australian libertarianism needs to be actively differentiated. I don't think this is too much of an ask, however. It's true that Australia, with the exception of Bruce Smith and parts of the old Free Trade Party, has never had a truly liberal political party, Workers' Party, but one that was actually significant, sorry. But this does not restrict us from picking up forgotten threads from elsewhere in history, like from the old classical liberals. Classical liberals fought battles against the anti-free trade corn laws and against slavery. They fought for women's suffrage and teamed up with the burgeoning labour movement to reject the corporatism of the capitalist class. Classical liberalism has a proud and rich tradition of progress and activism which squares easily with the Australian conception of the fair go. Contemporary bleeding heart libertarianism, with its acknowledgement of social problems and its advocacy of non-government solutions to these problems, offers a viable base from which to build Australian libertarianism. Another reason to embrace bleeding heart libertarianism is that Australian libertarians need to play an active role in shifting politics towards a culture of one where people look at the government with more scepticism than they do currently. Part of the way to do that is to rehabilitate the image of the free market and reinforce the strengths of society. Bleeding heart libertarianism means being able to articulate the values that we all hold dear: private property, free exchange, free speech, to name just a few, in a way that doesn't just pay lip service to social justice. This is not a foreign concept to Australia. The Hawke and Keating governments in particular were able to underscore their massive reforms to the Australian economy with a fundamentally progressive notion that economic growth is what would liberate the least well-off from poverty much more effectively than a slew of trade barriers and economic protectionism. That is certainly not to say that Hawke and Keating were perfect, but it's a tough legacy to dismiss. We have to be able to do this, and do it convincingly, and this means moving beyond simply saying that tax is theft or worrying about our own hip pockets. It means doing better than simply paying lip service. The enemies of freedom have grasped and maintained the upper hand on the debate over free speech in particular, partially because the arguments being made in favour of free speech are sometimes made poorly. Sure, in the strictest sense, George Brandes was right. We all do have a right to be bigots. We have a right to be bigots in the sense that bigotry should not be constrained by the law. But the lack of free speech laws in this country means that our political culture is notoriously bad at recognising the idea that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's morally right or socially acceptable. But this is a fact, and it means that we absolutely have to be able to convince people that when we say we believe in free speech, it means we don't believe that speech should be free of consequences, or that people have a right to a platform. And I think this goes back to what Ben was saying earlier about people complaining about how this, that, and the other is biased, and how why won't this particular news organisation bear my views. We don't believe that if somebody calls you a mean thing in response to something that you have said, that means your right to free speech is being violated. It also, however, means taking a principled stand wherever speech is quieted. It means defending Queenslander Lex Wotton's right to speak to the media without needing to ask permission from his parole officer. The need to be convincing leads neatly into the final reason that bleeding heart libertarianism has a lot to offer Australian libertarianism. And it's also what I anticipate will be the most controversial reason, and that is this. Libertarianism needs to stop being a fringe ideology of rich white men if it is ever going to prosper. The state used to be the oppressor of women and racial minorities. We all know this. The state once took away their civil rights, their rights to own property, and their rights to work. Discrimination in the private sector was also widespread. Thankfully, the state has mostly vacated the space of discriminating against particular minority groups. But since it has done so, it has refashioned itself as their benevolent protector. We know that this is nonsense. If libertarianism is going to successfully push back against this encroaching state, it needs to be able to respond to the concerns of people who aren't rich white men. In short, there needs to be a credible alternative on offer. In my own work as a policy analyst at the Centre for Independent Studies, I strive to bear these principles in mind. It manifests in my approach to various aspects of public policy. Regulation of the childcare sector, for instance, which is an area in which I research, is bad because it restricts access to childcare services for low and lower middle income women in particular. I argue that it's these women who bear the burden of the financial penalty of lengthy periods of time out of the workforce, and the burden of the insecurity that comes with being financially dependent on a relationship with another person. This is also why our system of family tax benefits is so problematic. The way that the policy is designed means that there are incentives for women in couple families to stay out of the workforce. This disincentive effect is a fact that the big, bad, mean Commission of Audit recognised in their analysis of the policy. But the government, led by our supposedly feminist Prime Minister, either cannot or will not acknowledge it and reform the policy accordingly. Instead, the government's so-called solution is a big government paid bread or leave scheme, which will cost the taxpayer a mozza and create socially unjust outcomes to boot. It is this emphasis on social justice which underpins bleeding heart libertarianism, and it's this kind of emphasis on socially just outcomes that is necessary to move Australian libertarianism forward into the mainstream.
So I thank Trisha for quite an interesting and rather compelling argumentation in favour of a new strand of libertarianism known as bleeding heart libertarianism. Next, I'd like to introduce to you Rachel Connor, and please, the floor is yours. Rachel.
Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. That was a tough act to follow. Thanks, Trisha. For those who don't know me, my name is Rachel Connor. I ran as a candidate for the Smokers' Rights Party in the election last year. I'm not going to talk to you too much about how I actually feel as a woman in politics. To be perfectly honest, I didn't really find any noteworthy difference between how I was treated as a woman and how I expect to be treated had I been a man. What people really did notice about me was that I'm not a smoker, and that's something that I'm going to come back to shortly. But given that this session is about young women in politics, I think I'm going to spend most of my time talking about my campaign, and why I think it's important to publicly defend ideas that might be really unpopular. So, my campaign was based around three main issues, and all of these I find to be fundamental to a free society. The first one is civil liberties, basically the right to do what you like with yourself, with your body, as long as you don't harm other people. The second, which is related, is private property rights, and the third is tolerance. So, during my campaign, I would have a lot of people ask me, always the first question is, so what are the rights of smokers? Do smokers even have rights? Do they have rights if they're harming themselves, or if they're damaging the environment by littering? Do they have rights if we have to pay for their health care? Obviously that's the most common question I would be asked. Do we have to allow smokers to do what they want if we have to pay for them? And look, the right of smokers, I would say, is the same as the right of everybody else, and that's self-ownership. And I think basically this means that smokers have the right to do whatever they want with their body, even if it's harmful, and that part is crucial, even if it's not good for them. They have the right to make that decision. I mean, after all, who has a higher claim on another man or on another person than himself? Self-ownership is a concept which I believe is at the heart of libertarianism, and I would even argue underlies the entire philosophy. So, because of this, smokers should be free to do what they like with their body and their property, even if it's harmful to them. And of course, there's the old cliche, with rights comes responsibilities. And no, smokers should not be littering. They shouldn't be harming other people. But we already have laws against these things. There's no need to come after smokers. We've already got laws, you already get a fine if you throw a cigarette butts on the ground. The same as non-smokers get a fine if they throw their rubbish on the ground. So, The most common reply I would get to this would be like, yeah, sure, smokers own themselves, but as long as we have to pay for their health care, we should get to have a say in their unhealthy habits. So let's have a quick look at the facts. Smokers currently, well, the marginal health cost of smoking come to just under $500 million every year, and this is from the government's federal budget. So that's a lot of money, $500 million every year because people smoke. But currently, every single year, again according to the government's budget, smokers pay $10 billion in smoking excise. That means smokers pay 20 times more in excise than the marginal health cost of smoking. And this is really important, like I'll say it again. Smokers pay 20 times more in taxes than they actually cost the public health system in extra costs due to smoking. So, to anyone out there who smokes, thank you for subsidising my healthcare.
Need more smoke?
So, following on from this, people would be like, but what about the rights of non-smokers? You know, their right to breathe clean air. And this is an issue we can solve quite easily with private property rights. Basically, I mean, we all understand that if you go to a non-smoker's home, you can't light up a cigarette. You need to respect the rules of their private property. That's something we all understand well, but more commonly people would want to talk about bars and be like, bars are a public place. No. But just because the public can enter a place does not mean it is public property. Public property is owned by the government. Bars are private property. Therefore, the government should not be setting rules. The private property owners, the bar owners, should be free to set their own rules on their premises. So, if we abolished all smoking regulations tomorrow, I very much doubt that every single bar in Sydney is going to be like, yes, you can smoke indoors now. No, I mean, there's a huge demand for non-smoking bars, and the Czech Republic is a really good example of this. It's one of the very few European Union countries that doesn't have bans on smoking indoors. But there's still many, many bars you can go to where you're not allowed to smoke. That's because there's a demand for it. The free market has solved this issue just by respecting private property rights. And that means when you go to the Czech Republic, you can have a variety of smoking and non-smoking bars. There's something for everyone. Another issue with this argument is that when you voluntarily enter a place where you know people smoke, your rights have not been violated. That's a voluntary decision that you've made to go into a place where people are smoking. For your rights to be violated, someone has to force you to do something against your will. When you voluntarily enter a smoking bar and breathe in other people's secondhand smoke, your right to clean air has not been violated. There is no problem there. And look, at this stage, I don't really want to discuss the science behind secondhand smoke, because ultimately it doesn't matter. If we respect private property and allow owners to make their own rules, the secondhand smoke science argument, it doesn't really matter. So, I said I would come back to my point earlier about people saying, like, why are you, as a non-smoker, defending the rights of smokers? And I think a lot of people thought, like, had an ulterior motive. Some people would be like, are you from the smoking lobby? Like, what are you doing? And this question used to blow my mind, and not in a good way. Because people, all the time, straight people, stand up for the rights of gay people. Australians always, not all Australians, but many Australians stand up for the rights of refugees. And we don't question them. It's very common for people to stand up for the rights of other people, and this is something that we should all be doing. It's not something that should be strange or questioned. And look, without wanting to understate the importance of standing up for those issues, it's really important, and I hope you'll continue to do so, but if you truly believe in civil liberties, you cannot pick and choose which civil liberties you stand up for. You need to stand up for the freedoms of minorities, even when they're unpopular. So, why do I do all this? I think there's a far bigger problem underlying the way we treat smokers today. The view that the nanny state is acceptable, or even that it's necessary, and that the government is responsible for our private lifestyle choices. I mean, this is extremely damaging, not only to our civil liberties, but also to raising the next generation of responsible adults. When you take away people's freedom to make bad choices, you take away any ability for them to learn from their mistakes. when you tell people that they are not responsible for their lifestyle choices, it shouldn't be surprising that they don't develop a sense of responsibility or learn to make good life choices. And look, there is another problem here as well. And this is one which goes far beyond defending smokers or even defending ourselves from the nanny state. And there's this attitude in our society that it's okay for the majority to enforce their will on the minority. And look, we can discuss the merits of using democracy to run a country another time. But to use democracy to enforce the personal lifestyle choices of the majority onto the minority is completely unacceptable. That is a blatant violation of civil liberties and something that we should not stand up for. Look, the idea that politicians and bureaucrats know exactly which decisions are best for you and that those decisions are exactly the same decisions that are best for me is absolutely obscene. I mean, in a world with 6 billion people, there's bound to be some difference in opinion in what constitutes a moral life or how you should live life to the fullest. Rather than trying to find a single answer to the best way to live, we should tolerate diversity and realize that what's best for you probably isn't best for me. To live in a free and diverse society, we need to practice tolerance and accept that sometimes other people are going to make choices that we don't fully understand or that we wouldn't personally choose for ourselves. And then we need to realize that that is perfectly okay. Thank you.
Very much like to thank Rachel Connor for a very principled statement against the application of paternalism in government policy in terms of what you inhale. And so our final speaker to your right at the head table is Lara Jeffery. Please, Lara, you have the floor.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julie. Am I sounding audible? Yeah? Fantastic. My journey to libertarianism came through politics. Like a lot of people, I was kind of a raging lefty when I was a child. Like Trish, I thought that the government was the arbiter of everything that was good and moral. All problems in society were matters for the government. So John Howard was, of course, Satan, and Kim Beazley was the best thing since sliced bread. These days I've been a member of the Liberal Party for 5 years. So it was through the Liberal Party that I was first introduced to the idea that freedom is actually a good thing. Even as a fairly government, a bit of a conservative. And that was the first time I was really exposed to that idea. It took off from there. A lot of that, I think, might have been a slightly contrarian response to party political culture. But that's where the journey started. And the reason I've ended up in the destination that I have, where I'm giving myself the new title of a rando-capitalist. I love Ayn Rand's glorious individualism and her rejection of supernatural concepts, and since status is going to state, they might as well state in a night watchman direction. But what keeps me here is firstly an ethical consideration. My first and most important consideration when it comes to government is that it is a monopoly on violence. And everything it does must be first assessed in the context of what is moral and what is acceptable. Again, there was a slight contrarian element. I do like to be a little bit more extreme than people around me, which this is how I round up on the radical right. And pragmatism. What nailed it, the underpinnings, I think, the underpinnings of my journey to libertarianism were emotional. But what sealed the deal was that pragmatically liberty leads to the best outcomes. A free market is the only system of resource distribution that is capable of lifting people out of poverty. It's the only mechanism that can actually do that. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. So, the things that I do. I'm director of MyChoice Australia, which is under the Australian Taxpayer Alliance banner, and we focus on nanny state issues. So, some people call us a think tank, we like to call ourselves a do tank. I like to call it right-wing activism and strategic communications. The campaigns we're running at the moment are pretty typical nanny state policy to scrap the alcohol tax. An incoming government with a mandate to slash and burn could give a nod to the base by removing a tax that doesn't bring in a lot of revenue and exacerbates the alleged problem that was allegedly introduced to allegedly solve. And the other campaign we're running at the moment is against the lockouts, which has been reasonably successful. We don't want to fight, but we do want to dance, and the pubs do want us there after 1:30 a.m.
I'm sorry. I'm getting a little bit slower and slightly better projection.
Sorry, thank you very much. Can we... All right. Okay, there we go. I also help out with the Australian Taxpayers Alliance's social media. So if you get into an argument with the page, that's probably my fault, so don't blame me. I'm a student at UNSW studying communication, also treasurer of Students for Liberty federally, and president of the UNSW chapter, assistant editor at Menzies House, and a semi-regular podcast called Taking Liberties, where I talk about current events. And the question that I'm always pursuing throughout all of this is, perhaps surprisingly, how do you sell liberty? I agree very much with Trish that we are at the stage where we need to move from identifying people who are already libertarian to convincing people who are liberty curious. We need to move out of the shadows and into the mainstream. And I've put this question to many wise people and received many wise answers, some of whom are sitting in this audience. And that's what I want to talk about today, with the caveat that I am a much better preacher than practicer. I'm not the greatest preacher. The first and hardest lesson came from Magate Wade, who I listened to through Students for Liberty. She's a Ugandan entrepreneur who had to leave the country and move to America in order to set up what has now become a very successful international range of beverages. Functionally, you can't organise a business under a corrupt government that requires a 90% rate of taxation. There's simply nothing to do. And the point that she made is very pragmatic on it. She simply be cool. This is probably targeted more at a student audience at the lower level, but when you are young and right-wing, there's nothing less cool than that. It does not make you popular with the other kids on the playground, and they don't really want to hang out with you if all you do is wear suits. It doesn't look like a lot of fun, and it's not a very good outreach strategy. I think as you get older, that certainly changes. As preferred ways of doing do change the way you age. And the second thing, so this came from Brendan Benioff, who's been floating around, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard him recently. In debate, you have to find your common ground first. So much of the time, we agree on the outcome that we want with the people that we debate. Whether that be a richer society, a healthier environment, whatever your particular issue is. Sometimes you don't. But when we do, we often wind up arguing because we're libertarians and everyone is a socialist, so it's nothing more than that. But it is not productive. It doesn't endear people to the ideology or the movement. So yeah, if Brendan can reconcile himself as a libertarian Marxist, I think we can probably reconcile the similarities we have with people who are not identifying as libertarian, classic liberal, etc. Something that concerns me a lot with the ideology is that it is very easy to be against something. It's very simple to identify things you don't like, but it is a lot harder to, particularly to paint the picture of the things you do like. Especially when it comes to libertarianism, which I think for most of us is a fairly negative political philosophy. And by negative, I mean it doesn't assert that you must do something, but it does assert that other people must not do things to you. Another point Magate brought up, and this is why I particularly love her, is that we have the moral high ground. As I said before, capitalism is the only thing that actually can make the world better. That human ingenuity, of course, needs to be allowed to function in the market. We need to assert that with the tenacity of the Socialist Alliance. They are wrong and they are quite possibly evil, but they are adamant. They're absolutely adamant. And having been adamant for 60 years worth of movement brings you to 2014, where there is an automatic presumption that those on the left have the kind and the compassionate outlook, and that these are the people who are concerned about the world and about others. And that having the moral high ground and having that kind of, the emotional and moral position makes a very good connection with people, I found. okay. Before I get on to the controversial point, the last thing is never underestimate the importance of internal communication. Organising libertarians is very, very difficult. This is because libertarianism is a terrible management strategy. Yes, it is exactly like herding cats. We tend to assume that individualists will motivate themselves, but they motivate themselves in another direction that they find more personally rewarding. So yeah, follow up everything twice, crack skulls, do the thing. Last and longest, reason is a great and wonderful thing, and libertarians have absolutely nailed explaining the logical and philosophical basis of liberty. Unfortunately, this is not the same thing as winning hearts. I believe, this might be a bit controversial, that reason is not the most significant factor in persuasion. I believe that emotion is. I believe that you will win more flies with honey than with Hayek.
Slow down, we can tweet.
For what it's worth, here's what I study. So I've spent a bit of time thinking about information processing and decision making and consumer behaviour. Most of the time, reason functions as a post hoc rationalisation. A person has been won over emotionally, and they need the tools to explain that to themselves and also to other people. So I suppose if you clarify that reason is certainly very important and very useful, fantastic and wonderful and everything is great, but when it comes to persuading, it gets put on a kind of pedestal, which I guess makes sense with a coldly logical ideology. But unfortunately, it doesn't translate well into bringing people into the fold. As Trish was saying, I think this is something that's very important moving forward. People need to feel comfortable with the idea of a freer society and with themselves in that. As much as governments have been the cause and enforcer of the class-based tolerance, they have repositioned themselves as the benevolent. They are the protector of vulnerable classes of society. And this is a myth it is a myth that needs to be disbanded. But it isn't disbanded by arguing that you have a right to be a bigot, as accurate as it may be. I think in this particular instance, it's explaining the role of the government in manufacturing and enforcing oppression, and addressing the idea that economic and social change, which takes a lot longer. And the reason that it takes a lot longer is there are 7 billion people that you need to convince instead of 100,000, however many things there are in the country. And that's a lot easier to do. So, the government was the first to respond to these issues. I consider myself a feminist and looking at that particular issue. I find it very understandable that people would feel the government is a benevolent benefactor. That it was always the first and most responsive of the spheres of society to the eventual raising of concerns for civil rights of vulnerable minorities. Unfortunately, reason can't do much to combat that because you're dealing with fear. You're dealing with an emotional block. And reason, it cannot do much for that. Persuasion occurs best when it is unconscious. If the brain is processing information inactively, that information receives a much less critical reception. It's more likely to be stored in memory and recalled and form a strong part of your conceptual basis in the way you perceive the world. Identifying a much-loved libertarian celebrity, who hopefully we all know, or telling a joke, possibly about lizards, will do more to positively dispose someone to smaller government than an extended debate about fractional reserve banking.
Everyone's favourite topic.
Yeah, I understand. I'll turn some libertarians off as well, but yes. The amount of effort a person is willing to put into processing information depends on an unbelievable amount of factors. How salient that information is to them, the time of day, whether they're hungry, they have something else they're supposed to be doing, the TV's on in the background, which is why it's important to slip this information in under the radar. And that's something that is best done with emotion because you are distracted by your emotional response whilst the information is reconciled with concepts you are okay, and it just keeps getting stronger. So you can dedicate your entire life to proving by every measure of evidence that capitalism is the only system of resource distribution that is moral and good and effective. And it is all of these things. And And reason gives tools to explain yourself. But reason can do that, but it gives you the tools to explain yourself. To explain yourself to yourself and also to others. So what it does is seal the deal. But if all you have is reason, what you actually have is a circle jerk. And if you look back at the points I raised, that was the theme that's running through them. Emotional persuasion is the thing we need to work on next. That's where we need to go in the future, because we need to win hearts as well as minds. And there is a reason the words occur in that order, in that phrase. Thank you.
So we'll have a good 15 minutes for discussion and debate, and we'll try to proceed in a fairly orderly fashion by a show of hands, and I'll pick you out from the crowd. But if I may ask initially the first question, given that the topic is young women in politics, I'd like to ask the panel, do they perceive that being Gen Y, does that serve as a facilitator or a detractor, do you think, in terms of your effectiveness in promulgating liberal and libertarian philosophies and argumentation? What do you think?
You're going to be asked next.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think there's not really a straightforward answer to that. I mean, for me, being young helps me hugely in maybe convincing people at university people will come along to the pub and discuss politics with us, but I have a much harder time convincing older people that I should be taken seriously. So for younger people, I think I'm far more effective than maybe somebody older, but for older people, that's not the case.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. There's definitely quite a barrier in terms of trying to relate to older people, because there's an instinctive, you young whippersnappers, what do you know? Yeah, so there's a bit of that phenomenon happening. I do think that being young also opens you to a lot of criticism from people who are slightly older, about the fact that you just don't know what you're talking about, you haven't really lived in the real world, what would you know about X, Y, and Z, what would you know about exactly how awful and terrible human beings can be. And that's kind of disappointing, but I think generally we tend to make a decent go of it regardless.
That's all right. I agree with what's been said. The flip side is there are some older people who think that young people are like wizards because we understand how to do computer. Given the way most communication is happening at the moment, I believe that politics is just a subset of communication, does open a lot of opportunities up.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll now have a show of hands in terms of questioning. There's a lady in the back with a beautiful child in her lap. Please, please start.
Oh no.
Hello. Trisha, it was a really awesome and interesting speech, and I really like your concept of leading hard libertarianism, but I have sort of, this is where I come up against the issues of how do you see that being implemented in a society of our size without going back down the sort of slippery slope of government agency.
I think you're right in that it is difficult. I think a lot of the time there's certain issues on which we can sort of agree with the left. I mean, I think a good example is the way feminists who are both libertarians and who are sort of your generic lefty sandal-wearing basket weavers. No offense to anyone who's a basket weaver or my but you know what I mean. With feminism in particular, there's the particular concern about sort of slut shaming and victim blaming in cases of sexual assault and rape. And from the libertarian perspective, it's quite clear that this is fundamentally an issue of social perception and of social values and how we perceive women and how we perceive sexual assault and rape. So for us, it's like, great, this is quite clearly an issue that libertarianism lends itself quite neatly to. But then on the other hand, you have some people who would otherwise be allied with us saying they want to do things like alter the burden of proof in actual criminal cases. So that is definitely something that needs to be avoided. I don't think that there's necessarily an easy answer to your question. I think it's pretty much like try your hardest and hope for the best and make sure you stick by your principles. And that means that however awful I think rape is, it means that I will never ever advocate for something that means fundamentally changing something as important as the burden of proof in a criminal trial. So I think it's really just kind of have to stick to your guns, know how far you can go and know when to stop.
Yes, please.
Question for Trisha. You mentioned
Voice, please.
Sorry. Hi, Trisha. Question from earlier. You mentioned, and I'm not sure if you actually said that libertarians are generally rich white men, or they seem to be rich white men, but it seems to me that this is a caricature that our political enemies, if you like to put upon libertarianism, and it's not clear to me that it's true of this political movement any more than it is true of any other political movement. So, for instance, if you do a profile of people based on voting intentions, people who vote Green tend to be amongst the more affluents within society. So I'm just wondering whether there's a danger in characterising ourselves that way, that we aren't actually buying into the narrative of those that are, trying to paint libertarianism into a corner. And I just would be keen to know your reaction in that regard.
Well, I think this is probably more of a problem with a political ideology full of really sort of smart people who are always really overthinking things. More generally, there's always this tension between wanting to stave off opposition, but at the same time wanting to make sure that our movement is the best that it can possibly be. And I think the left, to an extent, really tears itself apart in this sort of stuff, where they try to balance, kind of staving off their opposition with trying to make sure that, they're basically the purest kids on the block. With libertarianism, I do think that probably in the US, I think it's not necessarily rich black men, that it is white men. Here, I think we've got a much younger, a much more diverse movement. So to talk strictly about the Australian experience, I think part of the way that we both avoid ourselves being painted into a corner and are able to kind of build our Australian movement effectively, one of the things we need to do is probably distance ourselves from, what American libertarianism has come to mean. I get what it is that you're saying, because, we would think that a united front is better, and we don't want to kind of, take on, we don't want to kind of give in to the stereotypes.
I suppose just to be really blunt, isn't Socialist Alliance, if you look at the people in Socialist Alliance, aren't they mostly white men?
Yes, but I mean, that's true of a lot of political movements, with the possible exception of the Green, which actually tend to be mostly women, I think. Really old. Yeah, that's actually true. That party of youth not so young seems young, actually is old.
So, do Lara, Rachel, do you have views that way?
Yeah, Terry, you're right. I think it is. I think it is true. I mean, if we look at this room, there is a lot of white and there is a lot of male. But I do.
Show of hands if you're a white dude. Raise your hand.
Yeah,
that's easily at least half the room.
And that's the social justice panel. But yes, you're right. It is certainly a phenomenon in the broader political spectrum. We've seen it just about everywhere. I think that's the nature of politics. You have to have a certain level of lifestyle and leisure time to be able to devote your mental attention to the intricacies of the non-aggression principle. You need to have, if you have no idea where your dinner is coming from, you're probably not going to be sitting around reading Hayek. You've got other things to think about and other things to do. So I think it's just partly a function of the political system. But then that still indicates a bit of a problem in the way things are run.
Okay, we might have a capacity for one more question. Yes, please.
Yes, I'd like to question your insistence on using the left-right dichotomy. Having been involved with the Libertarian movement in Australia since the early 70s,
Bravo.